It's certainly great to see you all here. Happy to have you all. Happy to be back and put closure on Dickens, which we started, about a year and a half ago, I think. So we'll kind of pick up where we left off with Dickens England Part 2. Well, you can see this cartoon while we're starting. Full credit goes to Doc on finding this New Yorker cartoon. I wish you would make up your mind, Mr. Dickens. Was it the best of times or was it the worst of times? It could scarcely have been both. So welcome all to Dickens. Might go away. There we go. Okay. Let me shrink this for me. There. Okay. All right. So fun way to kick things off. We'll on our last session, we'll close with another New Yorker cartoon that Doc also found that's, I think, even more hilarious.
And pretty tasteless, too.
Well, that's coming from you, Doc. So, okay. So, this is not from Tale of Two Cities. This is actually from, gosh, I forget now. Dombey and Sons, I think. And it's just a way to portray the classroom during Victorian times in a lousy private school. So tonight we will discuss the importance of historical context, causes and various stages of the 1789 revolution, initial characters that you were introduced to if you did your reading. And this will all pertain to only book one. We're going to avoid spoilers. So please, if you have read the entire novel, we'd ask that you not go beyond book one tonight. So, A Tale of Two Cities. Dickens published this in 1859. It was his 12th novel. The year before was Little Dorrit, and following will be Great Expectations. We'll talk about Dickens' life in another session, so we're not going to get into any bio tonight. But Dickens attempted his second go around with having his own magazine. This one called All the Year Round, and to inaugurate it, he decided that he would, to promote sales, obviously, he would publish A Tale of Two Cities in weekly episodes for all the year round, since it's a weekly magazine. But by now, Dickens was a publishing empire, so he's actually going to have Tale of Two Cities come out in 3 different versions, not all, well, 2 at once. The third version, the complete volumes, once he was finished the episodic versions. Prior to A Tale of Two Cities, most of his novels were released in monthly wrappers. This was the first wrapper for A Tale of Two Cities. All of the wrappers for serialization, as it was known, which would come out monthly, looked like this. And they are a foreshadowing. His wrappers always were a foreshadowing of the whole novel, even though he didn't necessarily know everything that was going to happen in the novel. He had his general construct, and his illustrators definitely didn't know everything yet. So let's just look at this in case you ever look at other wrappers of Dickens novels, and it's a fun way to read serialization. Ginny and I are doing that through the Rosenbach Museum at this time, reading Pickwick Papers, which came out in monthly form, and then we have a presentation of it every month with the Rosenbach. And if you don't know anything about the Rosenbach and you're looking for more entertainment kind of like this, if you want to call this entertainment, highly recommend it. Go to Rosenbach and you'll see many different presentations. Most are free. So anyway, At the top of the wrapper is a register that contains St. Paul's, the Thames, the spires of Rennes' late 17th and early 18th centuries, city churches, and bales and barrels suggestive of marine commerce. In the central space, Brown had placed the blasted tree to suggest the devastation caused by the revolution in general, and in particular the destruction of two families, Madame Defarge's and Saint Evremon's, and presents thumbnail sketches of 7 scenes from the novel: the Old Bailey trial of Darnay, upper left, and Tellson's Bank, upper right. Then you have in the center the title with Lucy Manette on the right, and opposite that, Teresa Defarge, who you'll learn more about next time. The pair both knitting, although Lucy's domestic work will be revealed to be a contrast to Teresa's patiently augmenting her secret record of those upon whom she intends to be avenged. The bottom registers, Notre Dame is flanked by symbols of violent revolution, a hatchet-waving male, and a pike-wielding female Jacobin. And we'll be talking about female Jacobins next week. 2 men disinterring a body in a graveyard at lower left appropriately balance the scene with Dr. Manette, the Bastille's shoemaking inmate, lower right, recalled to social life after years of being buried alive, and the culminating journey by tumbril to the guillotine under the title Center. The golden thread, of which Dickens speaks in the text as one of love rather than of vengeance, connects all 6 scenes in the lower register. So once again, this is what it looks like. So these wrappers were anticipated and looked forward to give a hint of what the tale in general was going to be about, the novel. And these monthlies were inexpensive and passed around to many, many people, or taken to taverns, pubs, public places, and then read aloud to people over and over again. That's why it's very difficult today for collectors to find a complete set of these. They're very priceless because they're in such bad shape. So what? Okay, I'm a historian. I'm not a teacher of literature. So when I read Victorian literature, I do it as a historian. So, for me, what is history? We've all taken a few history courses in high school. Based upon those experiences and what you're reading, how would you answer the question, what is history? Not yet. Well, there are different angles. According to James Axtell, many former and current students have been subjected to an unrelenting dose of objective-sounding, fact-ridden textbooks and bombarded with so-called objective tests on an assortment of scarcely related names, dates, and events. I'd like to think that my classes weren't like that, by the way. From Hugh Trevor Roper, one of the great British historians, if we are to study history as a living subject, not merely as a colored pageant or an antiquarian chronicle or a dogmatic scheme, we must not indeed lose ourselves in barren speculations, but we must leave some room for the imagination. All in all, the best histories are the best stories. And that's where I stand. I saw myself as a storyteller, and I tried to conduct as many classes as I could in that kind of format to make history interesting and not just a bunch of cold facts that you memorize and spew forth. That's why writing was so much more important in a history class than taking multiple choice questions, unless, of course, you were stuck in an AP class, and then you had to know how to do that too. But history is not fact. History is, for me, history is not fact. History is the interpretation of fact, and it depends what you bring to the table as to how you are going to interpret that history. And so that's why there, can be many, many interesting and sometimes currently, unfortunately, ugly confrontations over what is history and what is truth and what isn't. So, but when I read a book like this, I'm reading it as an historian and understanding that whatever my prejudices are, and we're all prejudiced, and I don't use prejudice here as a bad word. It's what makes us interesting. You know, what our religion is, what our gender is, our age, et cetera, et cetera. Those all flavor how you're going to read things. Okay. Dickens had observed dramatic changes in his lifetime. Born in 1812, died in 1870. England was evolving from a rural to an urban society. That's a photograph of in London, by the way, or actually Manchester. The class system evolved with the burgeoning middle class and the new industrial worker. The House of Lords still predominated, but Commons was pushing for change, mostly by middle-class people at this point. The electorate was expanding as a result of the reform bills of 1832 and 1867. During Dickens's life, there'll be a third reform bill passed after he passes away. British technology and scientific thinking made progress on many fronts seem inevitable. And it's in that context which he decided, Dickens, to write A Tale of Two Cities. So, the French Revolution. Well, from the long view, England, of course, is coming from an English constitutional monarchy that was established as a result of the Glorious Revolution. In part one, we went over that in more detail. Part one, all 5 sessions, or how many it was, is available on YouTube, by the way, if anybody's interested. So Britain has a monarchy, but it's a limited monarchy by the Constitution and by acts of Parliament, mostly by lords in the earlier days. But by the time we're coming to the end of Dickens's life, Commons is gaining more and more power. There's a Bill of Rights that was established in the Glorious Revolution. And this is going to protect individuals to a certain degree. If John Locke sounds familiar to you, Lockean rights are what the Bill of Rights was grounded on. Everyone has, quote unquote, life, liberty, and property. Parliamentary limits were placed upon the monarchy, and this was beginning with the reign of William and Mary. For the first time, so no longer an absolute monarch. But the French had absolutism, and it was based on divine right, God-given, and that was not going to change. Louis XIV, of course, helped to establish and strengthen a very powerful divine right monarchy. He's thought to have said, I had no intention of sharing my authority with them being everyone else, that it wasn't royal. They do have a parliament of sorts, although you can't say parliament actually, because in France there are parliaments and those are courts. But their version of a British parliament would be the French Estates General. Met in Paris, but only met in Paris whenever the king decided to call it, and the king rarely ever called it, and it was powerless. So what were the causes of the French Revolution? Well, you have the Enlightenment. Any of my students, former students, would know about the Enlightenment. This is the age of science and reason, new information that would contradict the Bible and provide greater understanding for the world around them, the emergence of what became known as natural science. The laws of nature, made famous first through Newton and his discoveries, and then Locke applying it to society. And that's where I come up with the idea that all man has the rights of life, liberty, and property. Jefferson would change that to pursuit of happiness. The American Revolution, of course, influenced the French radicals. And as often is the case, there was a financial crisis. Louis had built Versailles and spent a huge amount of money on various wars with England. And his successors, the 15th and 16th, would continue those profligate spending sprees. And so they're broke by the 1780s. And what are they going to do? How are they going to come up with this money? Well, they make the fateful decision to call the Estates General for the first time since 1614. You could see it wasn't used because an emerging middle class that was demanding to have a voice, because they saw what had happened in America and what had happened in England. And they said, we want it too. This cartoon, contemporary to the Revolution, illustrates the problem with the Estates General. You have the estates crushed by the tie and various other taxes. That's what's engraved in the stone. And who is standing on top of the stone is the first and second estate. The first estate is the clergy on the left. Second estate is the aristocracy. And the third estate, of course, which is everybody else, which is most everybody else, is being crushed. And because all they would ever do typically was just pass on more and more taxes to the third estate, which now included a growing, prospering middle class who were educated, who had a voice, and want more of a voice. And that's where the trouble starts. So we break the revolution up into various phases. The revolution starts in 1789 and ends in 1815, because I include Napoleon as one of the final phase of the revolution. He's a product of the revolution, and I think to leave him out of your understanding of the French Revolution is incorrect. So in June 1789, the newly formed National Assembly, which was formed as a result of the calling of the Estates General, they issue the Declaration of Rights of Man, representing the emerging middle class. Absolutely, they had read Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and that was clearly one of several pieces that influenced the writing of the Declaration of Rights of Man. The goal here was to establish a constitutional monarchy, much like England already had. But things didn't go well. In 1791, they formalized the Constitution and they renamed the National Assembly the Legislative Assembly. However, by now, in those years, an informal group known as the Paris Commune has emerged. There's also communes in several other large cities throughout France. One of the other most notorious ones beyond Paris is in Lyon. But they haven't solved any problems. All they're doing is they've now created a debating forum where they can now criticize the monarchy and everybody else that they want to. That's going to get a lot of people upset. The sans culottes. This was the everyman. This is the third estate. It's a fashion statement. The culottes are long pants. Instead of, they couldn't afford to purchase the knee breeches with silk stockings or even any other stockings. They were also impractical. So they started wearing long pants. So fashion, yes, does play a role in the French Revolution. In 1792, the Legislative Assembly is overthrown and they establish the National Convention. It's a republic. They behead Louis. And they established the Committee of Public Safety. And the goal of the Committee of Public Safety was to root out those who were opposed to the revolution and who were going to block an attempt to establish the rights of man and citizen. This is also going to be known as, of course, the Reign of Terror. 1795, the Directory will overthrow the National Convention, and you see the middle class, upper middle class, trying to take back their initial goals from 1789 to 1791. They're not going to succeed either, and more blood will be released. And by now, there is war taking place on their borders. And so Napoleon will step forth and establish the empire, and we know how that goes. In 1815, he'll be defeated a second time, and the French Empire will be reestablished. So those are the phases of the French Revolution. And if you could just take a look at this and go and say, well, that failed, that's overly simplistic. The reality behind the storming, this is an engraving of the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was the hated symbol for the empire, for absolutism. It was a jail. Earlier, it had housed a lot of prisoners. By now, it housed very few prisoners, and there really were no political prisoners in it when they storm it. But this was a way of frustration being let out. And of course, it's going to be a centerpiece. I'm not giving anything away here, really, in A Tale of Two Cities. The Bastille dated from the 1300s and was similar to the Tower of London. Approximately 1,000 local Parisians, including 21 wine merchants. I think that's an interesting fact, and considering the role that wine plays in this novel, attacked the symbol of tyranny, which was occupied by 114 soldiers. Fighting continued from mid-morning until 5:30 p.m. A nearby force of Royal Army troops, highly trained, well-armed, was never called in to help defend the Bastille. To this day, historians really don't have a good answer for why that didn't happen. 98 revolutionaries and 1 defender will die in the fight. The 7 prisoners released included 4 forgers, an Irish lunatic, a deviant young aristocrat imprisoned at the behest of his family because he criticized his father, and a man who had conspired to assassinate Louis XV of France over 30 years before. So you could say the one guy was, the would-be assassin was the one political prisoner. But no big deal to release these guys, but it was all about just attacking this hated symbol. Okay, the Reign of Terror, 1793 to 94. And of course, the high point being the execution of Louis XVI. The legislatures devolved into combative left and right wings. This is where we get the term left and right for the first time because of the seating arrangements in the Estates General. The Paris mob pressed the government ever leftward with the continual threat of violence. It is during the revolution that the phrase liberty, equality, and fraternity emerges. Liberty and equality, of course, are common words at this point, hated by aristocrats, hated by monarchists. Fraternity is the radical one, because fraternity was really kind of the basis for what's thinking will emerge later on in socialism, and this idea that the common man was related no matter whether you lived in France, England, America, Russia, or anywhere else. It was a radical idea for the time. The Republic of Virtue's execution, the Committee of Public Safety decided to rename themselves the Republic of Virtue. It wasn't very virtuous. So, of course, this is where the guillotine was put to use quite heavily. But history has created a myth, the myth being that they lopped off a lot of aristocratic heads, which is just not true, because we do have records. 6% of those executed were clergy. 8% were nobility. 25% were middle class. And 61% were the urban workers and peasants who made up the Paris Commune and the other mobs. And so they obviously turned upon themselves. And there's all kinds of evidence to show how they went against their friends and carried out grudges. And it really wasn't about politics. It was about what they could get out of it. So that's the tragic tale of the Reign of Terror. Those who intended to change and revolutionize French society fell upon themselves more than they did their enemies. This is a contemporary cartoon broadside. These were published as single sheets, black and white, and then they hired a group to hand color these. James Gilray is absolutely the ultimate cartoonist broadsidist at this time, and he chronicles the French Revolution. And this was in relation to the Reign of Terror that was taking place within French society. And the translation at the bottom is a family of sans-culottes refreshing after the fatigues of the day. Gilray, of course, is very British, very middle class. And I think if you take a look at this, you get the idea that there are a lot of concerned British citizens over the news, fake news though it may have been, coming out of France and what would happen if it crossed the channel. And we'll be talking about that because that absolutely is important context for Dickens writing A Tale of Two Cities, though we're not going to do that tonight. But pretty gory picture. Simon Schama, a living historian, has kind of written the seminal volume at this point. There are plenty of others, but in my opinion, this pulls together, I think, the best research that we have to date. It's a doorstop. It's a heavy read, but it's a good read if you really want to know about the French Revolution from the inside out. But his main points. Patriotism versus liberty was the big thing. And of course, when I taught, it was always about the struggle in any country, any society. To me, history is always about the struggle between liberty and order. In this case, Schama put it in patriotism versus liberty, a brutal competition between the power of the state and the effervescence of politics. 18th century citizenship was the public expression of an idealized family. And of course, this comes out of the thinking from such things as the Declaration of Independence, and the writings of Rousseau and others. Revolutionary violence in many ways was the revolution. And this is essentially his main message that he spent 900 pages explaining. Violence overtook the revolution. It wasn't the original intention, but the young kind of ate themselves, sadly. The revolution gave birth to a new political world that was a product of two irreconcilable interests: the creation of a potent state, the creation of a free citizenry. And we see this struggle, I think, in our own country today between a potent state and how some people define that differently of different groups, as well as a free citizenry and how free is it? And does everyone enjoy that freedom? To me, these are the driving forces of at least Western society. I'm not an expert in any way of Asian societies or African societies, but I think in Western society, these are two central struggles throughout the course of our history, right up to, unfortunately, today. The initial dream back then was the belief that on the ruins of monarchy, aristocracy, and Roman Catholicism, because the radicals did want to destroy, not eliminate the church, but weaken the church, would sprout a new natural religion based upon things civic, domestic, and patriotic. Because patriotism was a new thing. Patriotism is really a 19th century invention, but also a byproduct of the revolution. Even in America, there's no real patriotism at the beginning. But the Reign of Terror liquidated that initial dream. So those are kind of the modern historians thinking about the revolution itself. And then I'll just throw in, for me, there are distinct parallels between 1789 and 1917. 1917 referencing the Russian Revolution. So quickly, because I'm talking too much here, so I'll go fast. Dickens, in a letter to John Forster, who was his most important confidant and who would write the first biography of Dickens, he wrote in a letter, "I set myself the little task of making a picturesque story, rising in every chapter with characters true to nature, but whom the story itself should express more than they should express themselves by dialogue. I mean, in other words, that I fancied a story of incident might be written in place of the odious stuff that is written under the pretense, pounding the characters out in its own mortar and beating their own interests out of them." So in this novel, unlike every other Dickens novel, there's much less characterization, which is one of the things Dickens is most famous for. So Dickens and his characters, and this is where I'm going to kind of shut up for a while. It's a great cartoon of the empty desk. This is after Dickens passed away, and some of his most memorable caricatures surrounding his desk, now empty. But for Dickens, everyone writing must speak from points of his experience. Dickens saw his art as a compromise between both invention and representation of the world around him. He took great delight in his ability to capture people's defining idiosyncrasies as he observed and reproduced them. And Dickens crafted portraits, composites of people known to him in details drawn from fiction, the theater, and other such sources. So let's do a little bit about the characters that you are first introduced to here in book one. Peter?
Okay, could I have them unmuted? I'd like to get some ideas here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Heather, can you do that?
I cannot, but everybody can do
Oh,
their.
okay. That's right. Unmute yourself.
Okay, so unmute yourself. This is a picture of Laurie and Lucy Manette. Now, with it, is there the text?
Yes, it's coming next. I just wanted them to look at this.
Okay, so
Let me just add here, Peter. So obviously, if they're reading with the original illustrations, they didn't see this.
Yes.
There are many, many variations in illustrations, which have become part of the rich text of Dickens in reading and rereading him today. And this is by Barnard, excuse me, who published in the illustrated editions in the 1870s. Here's your quote.
Thanks. Okay, everyone. So what I'd like you to do is to take a look at this quote from the book and find whatever you think is suggestive of the central issues of the novel. Now, this could be imagery, characterization. I asked a question about oppositions, dark and light. So take a minute, look through this. And
Do you want to read it, Peter?
if I have time, sure.
Of course.
The obscurity was so difficult to penetrate that Mr. Lorry, picking his way over the well-worn Turkey carpet, supposed Miss Manette to be for the moment in some adjacent room, until, having got past two tall candles, he saw standing to receive him by the table between them and the fire a young lady of not more than 17 in a riding cloak, and still holding her straw traveling hat by its ribbon in her hand. As his eyes rested on a short, slight, pretty figure, a quantity of golden hair, a pair of blue eyes that met his own with an inquiring look, and a forehead with a singular capacity remembering how young and smooth it was, of lifting and knitting itself into an expression that was not quite one of perplexity or wonder or alarm, or merely of a bright fixed attention, though it included all the four expressions. As his eyes rested on these things, a sudden vivid likeness passed before him of a child whom he had held in his arms on the passage across that very channel, one cold time, when the hail drifted heavily and the sea ran high.
Doc, since you're opening this up, I'm going to stop sharing for a little bit. We'll get back into the slides and when you're done with this
Yeah.
little discussion.
So tell me what you think. What are you finding there?
To me, the room seems really dark until he sort of focuses on Lucy, and then her golden hair, her blue eyes, the candles have illuminated the scene. I think it's a sort of, it's a transportation from darkness to lightness.
Excellent.
In recognizing who she is and seeing what she looks like.
Okay. Anyone want to follow that up? I see Beth over there.
Oh man, I didn't expect the Socratic. I was somewhat taken by the juxtaposition of old and young and present and past. That's demonstrated in the relationship between Miss Manette and Mr. Lorry.
Yeah, and the past, of course, is infusing, the present here. Yeah, very good, very good. Keep going. Come on, folks.
I think the golden hair, that's a metaphor that you see throughout the book. It shows the contrast between the gold that both the aristocracy want and that the poor people want, and that comes to her naturally. She seems almost like a religious figure herself in how she presents herself to people and how kind she is, and always with the golden hair, which is kind of like a halo for her. And we're reminded that it's natural and not the man-made gold that everybody else seems to want.
Excellent. I just gave you a table slap, and for the rest of you, the table slap is an indication of my approval and admiration of a statement made by one of the participants. So you got a table slap. That's like a big deal. Yeah, I mean, think about golden hair. Any other ideas about it? I mean, it's angelic, as you suggest, right?
Doc, it's also, I think, I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead.
It's sort of a spoiler. We're only talking about book one, but I mean, it's the whole current and historical premise of a golden thread. I mean, she's maybe the most important character in the book in a way.
Certainly, symbolically, she is very important. So, yeah, and of course there is the contrast. I mean, she brings light. She brings light to this scene. One other thing that I asked you in the questions was what Mr. Lorry is all about business, right? He says it so damn many times, right? So what I'm wondering about is, given that one other question that I have about oppositions, what do you see in Lorry here? Is he Mr. Business?
There's a degree of sentiment creeping into, this child that he took across the sea, right?
Excellent. And I think that's there again, the oppositions are also sometimes parallels. But here you have, so many instances of him saying, okay, I'm a man of business. I'm a man of business. I'll do this as a man of business, even to the extent, well, okay, how are we going to get Manette out of here? I've got it. This is what I do. I'm a man of business. But at the same time, there's this almost parental kind of feeling that he has towards her, and I think there are a lot of parallels that you can draw between Lorry and Manette himself.
As the
this-
reader, I was never quite sold that he was just a man of business. I felt like every time he said it, he's just trying to make himself believe it, that he's just a man of business and not sentimentally sort of attached to this whole scene.
And before this, his eyes were described as moist and bright, and I think, this particular gentleman doth protest too much. I mean, it's like, nah, he's not a man of business only. I mean, he's a man with a great heart.
We'll leave it right there, and we have a couple more characters to discuss, and then we're going to throw it all open.
You'll bring the slides back up.
Yeah.
Well,
Wait
the
a
next slides are coming up. I just want to thank Doc and Kendall for letting me join in here. For those of you who know, my thing is been in athletics all my life, but I am a huge Dickens fan, and I have read every single Dickens novel, starting when I read David Copperfield in 7th grade. I have been hooked on Dickens, and thanks to Kendall, I've been able to join the Dickens Fellowship, and I'm just really enjoying delving into these books in so much more detail. So my two characters I'm going to be following through the book are Jerry Cruncher and Miss Pross, who sort of at times are the comic relief of the book, but also have a very vital part in the plot. And as Dickens goes along, he's going to drop crumbs sort of about things in their lives that, by the end of the book, you're going to learn more about them, and they become sort of very essential to the plot in the end. So when we first meet Jerry Cruncher, and here's a picture of him right here, we've had the first chapter where they've talked about all the terrible things going on in England, the highway robberies and how terrible everything is. And they're trying to get that carriage up Shooter's Hill, and all the riders are out of the carriage to help the horses get up the hill. And they're worried about being robbed. And so in the midst of all that, all out of the mist, all of a sudden, horses' hooves are heard, and somebody's coming out of the dark. And of course, it's Jerry Cruncher, the messenger from Tellson's. And on page 11, it says, one of the guardsmen says, "I don't like Jerry's voice." "If it is Jerry," growled the guard to himself, "he's hoarser than suits me as Jerry." And there's talk about his voice, and you're just I'm going to just throw out things for you to look for as you move along. And then, of course, he delivers the message, recalled to life, is when he tells Mr. Lorry why he's there. And he says, "What's the answer?" And the answer is recall to life. And Jerry says, "You'd be in a blazing bad way if recalling to life was to come into fashion, Jerry." And for those of you who haven't read the book, pay attention to all these little thoughts of his about being recalled to life. He then proceeds to drink his way home by stopping in various taverns as he goes, and they start to give a description of him. So on page 15, if you have the Penguin edition, it starts with, "He had eyes that assorted very well with that decoration of being of a surface black, with no depth in the color or form, and much too near together, as if they were afraid of being found out in something singly if they kept too far apart. They had a sinister expression under an old cocked hat, like a 3-cornered spittoon, and over a great muffler for the chin and throat, which descended nearly to the wearer's knees." Then I'm going to jump ahead where he talks about the fact about his hair when he takes the hat off to scratch his head. "Except on the crown, which was raggedly bald, he had stiff black hair, standing jaggedly all over it and growing downhill almost to his broad, blunt nose. It was so like Smith's work, so much more like the top of a strongly spiked wall than a head of hair, that the best of players at leapfrog might have declined him as the most dangerous man in the world to go over." And this is what I love about Dickens, his ability to describe people in such a vivid fashion, is this idea that his hair is so spiky, you would be afraid to jump over it. And so Jerry appears here at the beginning as a messenger. He's going to return with a recall to life as his message. And then we're going to follow him as we move into book 2 and see what else he is up to besides delivering this message. Miss Pross is my next character. So I'll jump over to her. She makes actually an appearance in the first book, but her name is never mentioned. So as you have right here, when we first hear of her, Lucy has been told by Mr. Lorry that her father is still alive, and she passes out. A wild-looking woman, whom even in his agitation Mr. Lorry observed to be all of a red color and to have red hair, and to be dressed in some extraordinary tight-fitting fashion, and to have on her head a most wonderful bonnet like a grenadier wooden measure, and a good measure too, or a great Stilton cheese. And if you don't know what Stilton cheese is, it's actually a layered cheese that's cheddar, then Roquefort, then cheddar, and it looks like a giant pie. It stands up super high. And so she becomes in as he's a man of business. She's a woman of action. When she sees that Lucy's down, she's like, get to it, people. And she says, why don't you go and fetch things instead of standing there and staring at me? I am not so much to look at, am I? And there's much more to this conversation, but you only see her in this brief instance where she really chastises Mr. Lorry for being so stupid as to just blurt this out to her and have her charge pass out. And so it's important as we go along and we follow Miss Pross and Jerry, who will pop up at various times in the book, that we keep track of what it is they're bringing to the novel each time they come in, and see if as we go along, maybe you can figure out where it's going to go in the end if you haven't read the book. So if you do you have the Eastern State one, I can just pop up for a second.
You
Were
know
you able to
what?
get-
I forgot. I apologize. I didn't put
That's
it
okay.
in. I forgot.
Well, I'll just give a quick thing on that. So
Sure.
in a Philadelphia connection in the book, as you get to chapter 9, the last chapter of book 1, where they see Dr. Manette and he's doing the shoemaking and he's locked away in a room. They're keeping him locked, very much like prison. Philadelphia connection there. For those who know Eastern State Penitentiary, many of you may have been there for Halloween. I know I've been down there for their Halloween action. That prison was built in 1829 and literally as a penitentiary with penance hoping for reform. And it was built with 500 cells of solitary confinement with a skylight in the roof that was supposed to be the eye of God. And people were put in there, and it was the solitary confinement was rotated around sensory deprivation. The prisoners, if they were moved out of their cells, had a hood put over their head. The guards that worked there wore padded feet so they couldn't hear them moving. And what they did was they assigned them labor. So what was called the Pennsylvania system was known as isolation and labor. And with that labor was shoemaking, weaving, and chair caning were the most common labors. And what they realized in 1829, when they thought this was going to be great and it was going to reform people, about 10 years in, they realized that this system was actually causing the inmates to go insane. And so Dickens visited there in 1842, and he was appalled by the system of isolation and that they were losing their sanity. And as you can see through the book, he will tie that into what's happened to Dr. Manette, that he is making shoes as they were in Eastern State Penitentiary. He was in isolation, where they talking about him being buried alive. He was actually living in isolation, and this really affected his mental state. And as the book goes on, you'll see that after 10 years or so, this is when his mental state started to deteriorate. And so it's important that there are connections with Dickens' travels to America and what he learned about Eastern State that he's brought into this book. And you can read about his visit. He actually wrote a whole book about his visit to America, but he was really appalled by Eastern State Penitentiary when he saw it and how it affected the inmates. So that sort of ties into that last part of the shoemaker. All right.
Apologies, Jenny. Thank you, Jenny.
No problem.
Okay, we sent these questions out. I'll just read them and then we'll open it up. How do oppositions, dark, light, best, worse, London, Paris, you think of some others, contribute to meaning? How does the setting act as a character? What's with Mr. Lorry's being all about business? Kind of addressed at that. Why the numerous references to Lucy's golden hair? And what questions do you have? And with that, let us continue. Jenny, Doc?
Okay, so if you'd all turn to, we'll do setting, okay? Because the picturesque element of, as Kendall mentioned, of this novel creates a fairly light amount of characterization. Like, I can't get excited, my opinion only. I can't get really excited about Charles Darnay. He doesn't do much for me. I was reading this morning an article about how he's the hero. I don't get it. But anyway, different story. But so what he was heavy on, though, was some really lush, suggestive setting with incredibly suggestive imagery. So if you look at the beginning of chapter 5, it's page 30 in in the Penguin, and it's the wine shop. So take a look at the first couple of paragraphs, that the first paragraph and then the one on 31, and tell me how this setting sort of becomes a character that before we really learn much about what is going on in France, we are introduced to it without really characters saying a word. What do you see there?
I think while people are looking, I think it's how vivid the imagery is of the red wine all over the streets and everything that people are doing to get that wine into their mouths. I mean, they're laying in it, they're putting their kerchiefs in it, they're squeezing it out of dirty rags into their mouth, they're putting their babies down and putting in their mouth. And I think it does a great job, vivid depicting of how bad things are in France at this point, which is a lot of what leading to the revolution. There was no food. The poor people couldn't afford wine, and they were so desperate they would lick it off the cobblestones of the street. And just
And
the
then,
whole mayhem of that was amazing. I feel sometimes like he writes like he's going to make a movie out of it. That
well, it's
he's
very,
so
very, I
vivid,
mean, it's totally visual, kind of,
so visual what
totally.
he does, and that whole idea of just everybody scrambling all over that street for the wine. And I just recently watched the 31, Ronald Coleman version, and that was, they did a pretty amazing job of that with everybody just all over the street sucking up that wine.
What's
And
interesting, Ginny, it's nuts you said that, like in terms of it being made into a movie. There was an article I read a few months ago before this even started. It's nuts. One of the Batman movies a couple years ago, Bane is basically Defarge, and who made it? Nolan. He basically was making Batman out of Dickens. Gotham City was what you just said, like the blood, like it's crazy. If we all go back and watch Batman now, it's Dickens. It's nuts. It's really neat. Like all that crazy descriptive he puts into the movie, like with Gotham, with the people, the blood, like it's there. It's crazy interesting. Yeah.
Nothing new under the sun.
Exactly. Right.
And
Exactly.
what you were saying, Ginny, I think for me, the characters become part of the setting. Because I agree with you, Peter. I struggle to invest in individual characters in this novel in a way that I don't when I'm reading something like David Copperfield, where I'm obsessed with all of the characters. But I think that, this setting, it's not just the pavement going every which way. It's the people, it's the masses of people crawling over the pavement, sucking the wine out of the barrels. And the same thing in that opening sequence in Britain, where it's all a dark and stormy night and they're slogging through the mud. That setting isn't interesting until you put people in it and you see them slogging through the mud, and the coachman up top sort of having the conversation with Tom and Joe about the time, about the night, about what do you make of it? I don't like Jerry's voice. I think he peoples the setting with these sort of set dressing characters that enhance it, and it becomes a cast of thousands rather than a cast where he zooms in on these individual characters. So it's a different mode for him than what I see in some of his other work.
And then back up when on page 32, when he talks about the hands of the man, first paragraph, who saw the wood left red marks on the billets, and the forehead of the woman who nursed her baby was stained with the stain of the old rag she wound about her head again. Those who had been greedy with the staves of the cast had acquired a tigerish smear about the mouth, and one tall joker so besmirched, his head more out of a long squalid bag of a nightcap than in it, scrawled upon a wall with his finger dipped in muddy wine, these blood. Yeah, that's exactly how he's creating setting through those characters. Yeah.
Is Dickens also saying that I think everybody wants a better way? They're so hungry that they're willing, they want the wine, but how they go about getting the wine really is putting them back 2 steps rather than going forward a step. And essentially, isn't that what happens? Kendall talked about it, that the revolutionaries ended up eating up themselves more than they did any good as far as progressing themselves, correct?
Yeah. So, but here's a question for you. There, within all of this, sort of squalor. And yeah, it's fairly disgusting. People, drinking wine or, licking wine off the street and stuff. But there was something here in this description that is described as being really kind of pristine. What is that?
While they're working at getting the wine, they're all cheerful, right? And when it's gone, they fade back into.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, okay, this is, yeah, there is a kind of cheerfulness. There's a lot of ambiguity here. I mean, like after in the beginning of the novel, when he starts, rattling on about how great England is versus France, then he spends a whole paragraph at the very end of chapter 1 speaking of how, yeah, well, our England right now is not good. It is not good. There's one thing after the other. But amidst the squalor, what shines? What is shining? What is flourishing?
Probably community, that they're all working together at a common task, and that will help them with the revolution so they can act as one.
Yeah, and they are kind of, and now I'm looking also for specific images. In all of the squalor, in all of the dirt, something shines.
I don't know.
Look at page 33, towards the bottom. Nothing was represented in a flourishing condition, save tools and weapons. But the cutler's knives and axes were sharp and bright. The smith's hammers were heavy, and the gunmaker's stock was murderous. So again, this is just part of that setting that is, of course, foreshadowing, the violence that has yet to come.
So I think he uses color very deliberately as well, right? So he's using light, but I think he does the same thing specifically with the color red. Red being wine, red being blood, red being stained, red being a power color. We're all invested in some form of like emotional red.
Yeah.
Even Miss Pross, she's
All in red.
I mean, right. She's got the red hair and she's a sort of a force to be reckoned with. But he does the same thing with light. And then we've got light sort of being a shine of hope, but also a point to pay attention to, right? You don't get stained with light, but you do get stained with red.
Amanda, it's good to see you.
It's nice to see you as
So
well.
long.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah. Okay.
So here's an interesting thought too, an article I read about Dickens trying somewhat, people were interested why he wrote about the French Revolution when the Indian Mutiny was going on at the same time. And they talked about the fact that the idea of red, the colorful like red on their hairs and the tigerish ways that he was tying in references to what was going on in India at the same time that was currently going on while he was writing this book.
Right.
The revolution was obviously before, but current politics while he's writing the book was the Indian Mutiny, and that off and on throughout the book he ties in different parts of those ideas.
But Doc, on page 2 of the novel, it talks about the Trumbles of the Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
The Trumbles are that's the cart. That's the cart that would lead prisoners to the guillotine. Mm-hmm. So on page 2 of the novel, they're already referencing. It says the farmers, death had already set apart by his Trumbles of the Revolution. Mm-hmm. So right from the get-go, they're talking about the foreshadowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good. One thing that the Victorians were huge on were defining moments. I remember taking AP classes to defining moments exhibition of pre-Raphaelite art at the Delaware Art Museum. And they were all about defining moments in people's lives, in the lives of towns and so forth. And so it became sort of a thing with Victorian novelists that they build you up, and then there would be a big scene that is so suggestive of so much that it sort of resonates for the rest of the the novel. And I was wondering if you found any particular scenes that work that way.
I'm not sure that this counts, but I was struck that Mr. Lorry seemed to have such a connection to bringing over Miss Manette originally when she was a child that he hadn't actually gone back to Paris in 15 years, and how much of an impact it seemed to continue to have on his psyche. You just sort of would see it in drips and drabs through the first few chapters.
And Beth, how does that build up further? I mean, how does that sort of like, when do you see that acting in a different way later on in the novel? Say, chapter 6-ish?
Hint, hint.
Haven't read it.
Is 6 the last one that was part of the chapter?
The shoemaker.
No,
Six
it's
is
like
shoemaker.
page 40 into 40, the shoemaker.
The shoemaker is 6.
Well, she did remember it, and he finally fessed up, but interested in other people's thoughts as well.
I sort of like the climactic part of the shoemaker, that last chapter where they're going up the stairs at every level and sort of building this climb. It's like they're around the turn and there's trash on the stairs, and then the next turn there's this, and of course they run into the guys. They're looking at Dr. Manette through the peepholes that he sent up to look, and of course that was very common in those days. You could pay money to go to insane asylums and just walk around and see people, and it was not uncommon for people to charge to do that. Now, of course, Defarge was saying, he was letting it inspire them for what was to come. But that whole creeping till they open the door and then don't quite come in, I felt like that was a big buildup to a big scene, of all of them.
Yeah,
being
and
together.
that's the recognition scene, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's when everybody sort of gets in the same room.
That's the big one. That's the defining moment of this
Recall to life.
of this section, I think.
Right, recall to life, and just that whole trip up the stairs sort of dragged it out, till they got to like open the door and there he is and what's going on.
And even the images of things like hair are repeated. Of course, there's the golden hair of Lucy, but on page 47, and even before that, Manette on 43 is described with his yellow rags of shirt lay open at the throat, parchment yellow. And it's sort of an interesting, juxtaposition of that parchment yellow with the gold that, that it's associated with her hair. And then, of course, on page 47, what does he take out of this blackened string folded bag? What does he take out?
Hair.
Golden locks.
The golden locks from his wife. Okay, so like all of a sudden you have plot working here, you have imagery working here, and you have all of a sudden the realization of character. Okay, he is on the verge of realizing the truth, right? A truth that he can barely barely connect with, given his circumstances for the past 18 years.
What I thought was interesting in reading this section, because I have read the whole novel, but it's been 2 years. So I'm remembering it in bits and pieces. And what's fun about it is how many of the little scenes that aren't the big, magnificent, life-altering scenes, I know will become significant later. So I was struck by how much is buried at the beginning of the novel. When Mr. Lorry is like, no, I'm all business. Or, like Miss Manette's forehead says things, but they're not quite saying things. Or there are all these moments where things haven't yet been recalled to life, but they will be. Madame Defarge just knitting and looking, but not looking, but seeing. There's so many little moments that will show up. She's described as not seeing, but I know she's seeing. Yeah. So it's just interesting to think about all of the little things that will be recalled to life over the course of the novel. I think in many ways by like disinterring Manette at the beginning, he's kind of creating a motif that will recur throughout the novel as more and more gets dug up, as more and more gets brought to light.
Yeah, yeah.
May I say something?
Well, of course you can say something.
I am so far behind everybody else because I'm still on the original quote when I was able to pop in with respect to obscurity and Mr. Laurie and Miss Vinette and that room. And I haven't read Dickens in probably 30 years, but I will say that passage strikes me, the more I've stared at it since you've been talking, as a birthing passage. First of all, Laurie, right? That's a mode of transportation. And Manette, little man, if you will. And then you have the candles. I looked at the paragraph before and it felt very dark. And then you have this next room. It's almost as if she's in a separate room. There are these candles. I hope this is okay. They strike me almost as if you could have legs. And then this sort of, going through into this other realm. And then this person who has almost like an Easter bonnet comes out. And then you have what almost looks like having given birth. The expression that he remembers is one of fixed attention, wonder, a bit of alarm, and what was the other? Wonder, alarm, perplexity, what a baby might feel as he or they enter the world. And then, you have the water motif, the channel, and bringing her her likeness into life. So I feel almost like a resurrection thing going.
That's it. Right?
Going.
I mean, this is about resurrection.
And anyway, it's just fascinating, and I just couldn't get past it. I'm sorry, I'm so far behind everybody else, but I was just amazed by that paragraph, which if you hadn't pointed it out, I might have just completely sailed right through.
Apologies are not accepted here. Brava. I say brava.
Yes.
That was an excellent comment.
You just got a table slap.
I did?
I did. I don't know if you heard it. I'll do it again just because.
Thanks.
All right. Should have heard that. Are there any, I mean, I know we sort of as usual are out of time, but are there any other like piercing questions that you might have that we haven't even come close to dealing with today? Come on.
Peter, you spoke about contrasts.
Yes.
One of the things that strikes me, that often strikes me about Dickens, is the back and forth between the brutal reality of life back then, unsanitized. I mean, right from the beginning, on the second page, where he talks about, where he describes the sadistic punishment of the child who,
that one child, yeah,
the child who just steals a loaf of bread or something and is just brutally
doesn't
murdered.
kneel when the monks
he doesn't
go by.
kneel for the monks.
Right,
Yeah.
he doesn't kneel for the monks.
And then and he goes back and forth between descriptions that make you shudder. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there is so much of it is sentimental, and I guess most of the books that I've read are one or the other, but Dickens goes back and forth between brutal realism and almost sort of sugary sentiment.
And sometimes too, think about the way Defarge is introduced. I mean, yeah, okay, he's making some money on showing off Dr. Manette, but in a sense, he has. I mean, people might disagree. I mean, I like Defarge because he's got some compassion. He's, after all, I mean, not a great life. You're banging on a woman's shoe for your whole life, but still, he's kept his former master alive, right? Even though we know that within him, we're told that there's a kind of immovability, with him. So yeah, so it's I think it's all over the joint, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have that kind of ambiguity.
Yeah. I personally, I'm far more affected I'm more deeply moved by the brutality that he describes than I am by the sentiment. The sentiment seems kind of forced, contrived, but the descriptions of unvarnished life are extremely moving.
You can also contrast the brutality with the excessive civility of the English people, that they go way out of their way not to offend anybody in their speech, but their nature comes out later and is just as brutal as anywhere else.
Yeah. And you see that at the end of the first chapter, right? It's like, yeah, and so here are things now, like what are things are like now in England? Not so good. Not so good. Yeah. Other last shots?
Yeah, I want to circle back to the wine. The fact that Defarge he doesn't care. He kind of just, okay, like he just sort of stands back, and yet he ends up being a key to later parts of the story. But the wine that comes to him is contained, and then we see chaos when it's unleashed, right? It breaks, and the people frenzy for it. And yet I think it's interesting that he is a step removed.
But he does get upset when the guy writes blood on the wall, though, actually.
Yeah, yeah. He doesn't partake until they deface something, which is it seems a little, I don't know, I guess it seemed strange at that point.
Yeah, yeah. And he might not like graffiti either.
But also, as the wine merchant, he has plenty of access to wine, so he's not needing to get wine, and he didn't care. He wasn't going to have to pay for it. It was the deliverer that got in trouble, so he could afford to stand back because he has wine and he has money.
Good businessman. It's a good businessman.
Plus, I think he was instrumental, wasn't he, in being Jacques and pulling together all the revolutionaries? So at the point where the casket burst, I don't think he was ready to make his move. So that's why
he's got them contained.
He didn't want to bring excessive attention to the incident.
Yeah, and it's working as foreshadowing of all the blood that will happen later, right? I mean, it's sort of like the chaos there. Yeah, it's over spilled wine. The chaos later will be over spilled blood, right?
Then I have one other thought on Miss Miss Manette. I like the thought of it being a halo, but my thoughts generally don't always go first to religion, and perhaps they should, but almost in a way of like an alchemy of hope and innocence and chastity, and whatever she touches, she's sort of got this Midas effect to her.
Oh, I like that. That's good. Yeah. I mean,
a lot more sophisticated than what I was thinking, but I was feeling so irritated with just the melodrama describing her and the superficiality. And I keep thinking of I mean, my modern day references is stereotypical Barbie. That, she. And then what the part is it when she's talking to her father in the tower and the weep.
Yeah. Oh no, it goes up. It's sort of overboard. Yeah. I mean, I think that is the sentimentality that Richard was talking about. But because I'm retired and have less to do than the rest of you, I looked up. What does blonde hair mean? Oh my God. It was just and blue eyes, it was like a minefield. Blonde hair, truth. Protection against, and the blue eyes are protection against the evil eye. Blonde hair is youth. Blonde hair is vitality. Blonde hair is beauty. Blonde hair is wealth. But blue eyes, good luck, karma, protection. So she's got sort of all of it, right? except she's a pretty, undeveloped character. I mean, she's kind of, I mean, there is the Barbie-esque element of her, but then we can probably say that about a lot of characters, right? I mean, there's not the kind of depth that we see in other, in other Dickens characters are certainly not there with Lucy Manette. I mean, to me, one of the richer characters so far is Laurie, just because he's he's contradicting himself, and he actually is very powerful in what happens. All right, we probably have to end because like Heather has to go to work tomorrow.
This was excellent. A good start. I mean, this is the way it's going to work for the next 4 more sessions to go. Hopefully we didn't bore you. Next time we'll start with a little bit of history on women in the French Revolution, and a little bit about Dickens himself and his important friend who was really a key source for writing this book, Thomas Carlyle. So thanks for your participation. Hopefully it will continue and get even more. Please feel free to yell at us, criticize us. We're all flawed people, but we have fun. So enjoy reading the book if you haven't finished it yet, and see you next time. I'll be sending out
next time, if I may add. Okay,
of course,
if
Doc.
It seems that you haven't read any of it, and you say something, and it's an indication that you haven't read, I'm not going to say anything, but I'm just going to give you the look.
And then you'll make them sing.
Way to promote participation here, Doc. I mean,
I'm looking for it, but
the warm and fuzzies as always. But then
I have the right to give the look.
Of course you do, because after being swept by the Phils, I mean,
oh my God,
what else have you got to talk about?
Oh my God, this is
Here we go. Here we
I'm
go.
so excited baseball finally made it in.
I know.
Doc is a lifelong Mets fan. I'm a lifelong Phils fan. He and I talk every Friday and talk a lot about baseball. Not as polite as this. This is actually very friendly. We really don't like each other, but we put up with each other. So,
yeah.
So we're
but
good
listen,
friends.
when you get older, you have to take what you can get.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good luck with those Mets. So
good luck with those
What's happening with the Phillies?
Great to see you guys, by the way.
Likewise.
Nice to see everybody.
Thank you
Thanks for
guys so
coming.
much.
Bye.
Ginny, welcome. Love having you in the class.
thanks again. See you all next week, I hope.
Thank you. See you
Bye-bye.
next week.
Bye.